What if I told you that the secret to writing better, more reliable code wasn't buried in some dense textbook, but in the lessons we learn from raising kids? It sounds a little out there, I know, but we're about to dive into this really cool idea from ColorLearn called Parenting.exe, and it draws this powerful and frankly super useful connection between these two worlds.
Okay, so what do parenting and programming really have in common? I mean, at first glance, it's a bit of a weird comparison, right? One is all about bedtime stories and scraped knees, and the other is about syntax and servers. But the connection between them is surprisingly deep.
It turns out they have more in common than you'd think, because when you boil it all down, both parenting and programming are fundamentally about managing ever-increasing complexity. And in both cases, the end goal is the same: to build something, whether it's a child or a software system, that can eventually function on its own, reliably and independently.
To really get this, let's start at the very beginning of both journeys. We're going to call this stage 1, the toddler. And as you'll see, this maps perfectly to the most basic style of programming out there, procedural code.
You know, the parallel here is it's perfect. If you've ever tried to get a toddler to do, well, anything, you know you have to break it down into the tiniest, most explicit steps. Procedural code works on the exact same principle. It needs a direct, sequential list of commands to do its job. There's absolutely no room for interpretation.
Just think about something like brushing teeth. You can't just say, go brush your teeth. No way. You have to walk them through every single action, one by one. It's pure hands-on micromanagement. And here's what that looks like as code. See, each line is just a single direct instruction. There's no fancy abstraction or logic you can reuse. It's just a simple to-do list that the computer follows without question, kind of like a toddler just following your lead. So in essence, procedural programming is the toddler stage of code. It's just a list of very specific, step-by-step commands. And hey, it works, but it requires your constant, direct supervision.
But here's the thing. Kids don't stay toddlers forever. As they get a little older, they start to understand routines, which brings us to stage 2, the preteen. And in the world of code, this is where we start using functions. With a preteen, you can finally graduate from micromanagement. You can say something like, get ready for bed, and they know that one command means a whole series of actions. In programming, this is the magic of a function. It bundles a whole sequence of steps under one simple, reusable name. In our code, this means we can take all those individual steps from the toddler stage and wrap them up nice and neat inside a single function, like this ready for bed one. Now, instead of listing out every single step, we just make one simple call. This is a huge leap forward in making our code cleaner and way more manageable. So really, a function is just like a preteen's learned routine. It's a self-contained, reusable block of instructions, and it represents that first real step toward building some autonomy into our code. And that brings us to the final stage of development, for both kids and for code. We're talking about the teenager who's learning to manage their own life. This mirrors the principles of object-oriented programming perfectly. Think about it. You don't tell a teenager how to get good grades step by step. You set the high-level goal, and they are responsible for managing their own time, their homework, their study habits. This is the absolute essence of object-oriented programming, or OOP. You create objects that are responsible for their own data and their own actions. So here we have a teenager class. This object keeps track of its own state, like whether homework is done, and has its own methods or abilities, like developing study habits. It's a self-contained unit that manages its own complexity. You interact with it at a high level, and you trust it to handle all the details itself.
So in short, OOP is the teenager stage of code. It's all about creating independent, responsible components that manage themselves. This is how we build truly complex, scalable, and maintainable software systems.
Okay, so this is a clever analogy, but what's the real lesson here? Why does comparing our code to our kids actually help us? Well, it all comes down to how we approach the single biggest challenge in software development. The crucial point is that both parenting and programming are really about managing complexity. In both, you have to constantly assess the maturity of the system or the child to decide how much guidance to give. You're always working to build autonomy and find that perfect balance between structure and freedom. It's a journey from total micromanagement to earned trust. And this metaphor is so powerful for a few key reasons. First, it humanizes what can sometimes feel like a very sterile, abstract process. Second,
It gives us a really intuitive way to understand when to use different programming styles, and finally, it scales perfectly with our own journey as developers, from writing little toddler-like scripts to engineering complex teenager-like systems.
So let's put this idea into practice. The next time you sit down to write or refactor some code, I want you to try thinking like a parent.
First, ask yourself, is this code a toddler? Am I spoon-feeding it way too many step-by-step instructions when really it could be handling more on its own?
Next, think about if your code is ready to be a preteen. Can you encapsulate some of this behavior? In other words, can you bundle some of those repetitive steps into a single, clean, reusable function?
And finally, ask the ultimate question. Is this part of my system ready to be a teenager? Can I design it as a self-contained object that manages its own affairs, building a system that is truly robust and independent?
Because whether you're raising a child or building an application, the goal is remarkably similar. You want to create something that can grow, become reliable, and eventually thrive, all on its own. Welcome to Parenting.exe.